Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Tonight we come to you with a big developing story. Russia says there was an assassination attempt on President Putin. Drone attacks on the Kremlin. It was reportedly neutralized. No injuries or casualties. Putin is safe, but the fallout could be this: an escalation in the war. Ukraine says it had no role in the drone attack. Russia says Ukraine did it. A lot depends on what Russia does next. Will it intensify attacks? How will Ukraine and its Western allies respond? On Vantage tonight, we'll bring you the updates and the analysis. Also tracking developments at the United Nations, India and China voted in favor of a Western resolution that called Russia the aggressor. The West is selling it as a political win. Is there a change in India and China's policy on the war? Why did they vote against Russia? We'll discuss that. The headlines first. More trouble for the BBC in India. A Delhi court has summoned the British broadcaster and Wikipedia in a defamation suit. The lawsuit was filed by a BJP leader over the BBC's documentary on Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Ceasefire in Gaza after a fresh round of fighting. A Palestinian prisoner on hunger strike died in an Israeli jail. Palestinian militants launched rockets at Israel. Israel responded with airstrikes. Now both sides have agreed to a ceasefire. As Kiev prepares for a spring offensive, Kherson announces a 58-hour curfew from Friday. It's a Ukrainian frontline city captured by Russia just days after the war began. The Russians withdrew from the city in November last year. Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi meets his Syrian counterpart in Damascus. It's the first such visit by an Iranian leader since Syria's civil war began 12 years ago. It comes weeks after Iran and Saudi Arabia restored ties. More than 100 people arrested in anti-mafia raids across Europe. Police in 8 European countries searched 150 places. The raids targeted the notorious Italian Calabrian mafia, which controls around 80% of Europe's cocaine traffic. And Dieselgate comes back to haunt Audi. Its former boss, Rupert Stadler, will plead guilty in the vehicle emissions cheating scandal. Audi's parent company Volkswagen admitted in 2015 to rigging emission levels in 11 million diesel vehicles. It's a bombshell headline from Russia. An alleged assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin. The culprit? According to the Kremlin, it's Ukraine. The Russians have already put their bombers on alert. Explosions are being heard in Ukraine's Kherson. It's all very confusing and uncertain right now. So first, let's hear the Russian version of events. The assassination bid is said to have happened last night. 2 drones were used to strike Putin's residence inside the Kremlin compound. Russia says the attack was repelled. Remember, the Kremlin is one of the most secure buildings in the world. Its electronic defense apparently disabled the drones. Is there any evidence for this? Well, so far, there isn't. Nothing concrete. All we have is this video being circulated on Russian social media. It shows a flying device heading towards the Kremlin. But as it gets near, it bursts into flames. Could this be a Ukrainian drone? Ukraine says absolutely not. They claim to have no knowledge about the attack. Listen to this.
Regarding drones over Kremlin, everything is pretty transparent and clear, but I will talk about it anyway. First of all, Ukraine undoubtedly has nothing to do with it, because there is no military value in such actions.
President Zelensky is not in Kiev today. He's in Finland for a summit with Nordic countries. Ukraine's ally, the US, is also saying the same. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he would take anything coming out of Russia with a huge shaker of salt. As for these videos, they're not verified. As of today, they're just claims from Moscow, and that's the tricky part. It's hard to verify things in a war. It's one version versus another. Let me quote Russia's official statement. 2 unmanned aerial vehicles were aimed at the Kremlin as a result of timely actions taken by the military and special services with the use of radar warfare systems. The devices were put out of action. The Russian side reserves the right to take retaliatory measures where and when it sees fit. Where was Putin when the attack happened? not at the Kremlin. He was working from his residence outside Moscow. Russia says fragments of the drone fell near the Kremlin. There were no injuries or casualties. Moscow is also linking the attack to Victory Day. It's celebrated on the 9th of May. It marks the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. So lots of claims from Russia. The question is, what do we make of them? At first glance, it does seem far-fetched. For starters, just look at the video. Does that look like a lethal drone trying to kill the president? It's gently floating towards the Kremlin, almost waiting to be blown up. Nonetheless, let's look at the two possibilities here. Either Ukraine did it or it did not. Possibility number one, Ukraine did try to kill President Putin. They keep saying that ordinary Russians are against the invasion. So if you take Putin out, perhaps the war ends, like cutting off the snake's head. The second possibility is this: Russia is bluffing. An attack on President Putin is an excuse to escalate. In fact, Moscow has already warned of it. Their statement says Russia reserves the right to take retaliatory action. And remember, alleged assassination plots are not new for President Putin. Reports say he has survived 5 attempts. None of them has been officially confirmed by governments. Many critics also dismiss it as propaganda, as an attempt to build the mystery and aura around Putin. Was this a similar case? Well, the timing is certainly suspect. Multiple sabotage cases have been reported in Russia in the last few days, most of them near the border with Ukraine. 2 trains were derailed in alleged sabotage attempts, one on Monday, another on Tuesday. Russia has blamed Ukraine for both, but Kiev has been silent. They've neither confirmed nor denied any of these claims, and that's one reason why this assassination story is spreading fast. Another reason is the looming counteroffensive. Zelensky says it will start soon. Listen to this.
This is why I am sure we will soon have aircraft, because we will soon conduct an offensive. And after it, I am sure we will be given planes. I would rather it was the other way around, as it would be easier for us. But it is like it is, and we are grateful for everything.
Ukraine wants to retake territories occupied by Russia. If that is indeed the case, then a Russian escalation could blunt Kiev's plans. It could also keep Zelensky preoccupied, meaning counterattack delayed. But like I said, these are all just possibilities. The real facts of the matter are nearly impossible to ascertain. Why? Because this is war. And truth is the first casualty of war. Zelensky says he has survived at least a dozen assassination attempts, a dozen in just over a year. Recently, he said he would have fought to death if Russia attacked his compound. And days later, this happens. If Ukraine did plot this attack, it's a laughable attempt. Using drones at the Kremlin is like plunging needles into an elephant. It's pointless and counterproductive. Plus, a failure would give Russia the initiative, something that the Kremlin already is doing. The next couple of hours will be crucial in this episode. An assassination attempt on the president of a nuclear state is no laughing matter, especially when that state is at war. We can't say whether the attack was fake or real, but here's what we can say. This may lead to an escalation. So both Russia and the West must show restraint. It's important to not raise tensions further with irresponsible statements. We'll be tracking this story closely. Are India and China rethinking their neutrality on Ukraine? I know it sounds impossible, but here's why I ask. Last week, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution. It was pretty routine stuff. The resolution talked about cooperation between the United Nations and the Council of Europe. Quick side note. The Council of Europe is a human rights organization. It has 46 member states, most of them in Europe. Its job? To defend human rights, democracy, and rule of law. Now, coming back to the United Nations, 122 countries voted in favor of the resolution, 18 countries abstained, only 5 opposed. Do you know what India and China did? Both supported the resolution. And why is this significant? Because of the language used in the document. Listen to this. The General Assembly recognizes the unprecedented challenges now facing Europe following the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and against Georgia prior to that. Let me repeat. Aggression by the Russian Federation. That is not neutral language. That language clearly mentions who is the aggressor and who is the victim. It's just short of calling it a war, which is why India and China's support is raising eyebrows. Remember, neither country has called it a war. Neither country has accused Russia of aggression. So why have they supported this resolution at the United Nations? And more importantly, does it signal a change in policy? I'll answer the second question first. No, there is no change in policy. The vote was probably prompted by the broader resolution. Russia is just mentioned twice in the text. The rest of it talks about generic stuff like the pandemic, democracy, sustainable development. Important but non-controversial things. Perhaps that's why India and China voted in favor. Having said that, we cannot totally dismiss this development, and I'll give you two reasons why. Number one, the West is going to town with it. They see this as a symbolic victory against Russia. Take a look at what the EU's foreign policy chief is saying. Resolution adopted by 122 votes, including key partners such as India, Brazil, China, and Indonesia. The resolution clearly qualifies war against Ukraine as aggression by the Russian Federation. Well, he's not wrong, because the resolution does exactly that, and countries like India, China, and Brazil did support it. These are all countries that have remained neutral so far. Now, the second reason why this is an important development. Voting for or against the resolution was not the only option. India could have abstained from the vote. It's done it in the past. South Africa abstained, for instance. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan abstained. So did Iran. And these countries are very close to Russia. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan are treaty allies of Moscow. Yet they chose to abstain. So why didn't India and China do the same? Only the governments can answer that question, especially Beijing. They've even proposed a peace plan to end the war. 12 points, 0 takers. Even that plan does not use the word Russian aggression. It talks about the quote-unquote Ukraine crisis. That's what China calls it. So symbolically, this vote will raise questions. Could China be looking to squeeze Russia or maybe pressure Moscow into offering concessions? At the moment, this is all speculation, but the larger picture is this. The longer this war drags on, the more pain countries will feel. More inflation, more supply chain issues, more shortages. If that turns into public outrage, every country will be forced to rethink. Have we reached that point yet? Definitely not. Until then, we must take the symbolism out of the resolutions. It's not a political win as the West would like to call it. Neither is it a setback for Russia. Because sometimes diplomacy is more complicated than a yes or no. And now let's talk about the US banking crisis. It's not over. On Monday, we told you about First Republic Bank. It's been sold to JP Morgan. And this has triggered new fears. Banking stocks in the US are down. Investors are worried. They fear that more banks are on the brink, that more banks could fail. But what's the basis of this? What is driving these concerns? That's what we'll discuss tonight, starting with the latest. Bank stocks took a beating on Tuesday. These were mostly mid-sized banks. What are mid-sized banks? Those with assets of $15 to $115 billion. It's a big range. These are typically banks that start as hometown banks, catering to a specific town or community. As they grow, they expand to nearby regions, usually by delivering highly personalized services. These are mid-sized banks, and they took a beating yesterday. Topping the list is a Los Angeles-based bank called PacWest. Stocks fell by more than 27%. Then we have a bank called Western Alliance. It lost 15% of its stock value. Third on the list is KeyCorp, down by 9%. A bank called Comerica shed 12%. Synovus Financial Corp lost 7%. These numbers translate into billions of dollars, and this trend is concerning. The question is, what is driving it? On first impressions, this seems to be a reaction to First Republic's takeover. We talked about this on Monday. First Republic has been sold to JP Morgan. It's the third bank to fail in this crisis, also the second largest bank failure in US history. Earlier, 11 banks tried to rescue First Republic. They injected $30 billion to avoid the collapse, but they couldn't save the bank. So the regulator stepped in, and the bank had to be sold. First Republic, too, was a mid-sized lender, the kind of banks we talked about earlier. And its collapse has left investors worried. They fear other banks will meet the same fate. The question is this an overreaction or a legitimate concern? Now, if you follow stocks, you know that they mostly react to sentiment. So it could just be that, a sharp reaction to a bank collapsing. But here's something that we cannot ignore. The vulnerabilities in the US economy, the collapsing banks have exposed them, and they could put pressure on other banks. Now, what are these vulnerabilities? First is commercial real estate. Valuation of commercial property has fallen drastically in the US. Prices are down by 20 to 25%. For office spaces, the decline is steeper. It's a fall of 30%. Now, how does this impact banks? Well, they fund the acquisition of such properties. A large part of their lending is for commercial real estate. The buyers take out loans, they buy property on mortgage, and they owe money to banks. Now there are signs of stress. Buyers are not being able to keep up with mortgages. In February, a leading property trust defaulted. Do you know what was the value of their debt? More than $1.7 billion. Last month, there was another high-profile default. It was of $161 million US. So clearly, commercial loans are under pressure. And that's one problem. Here's another. Banks are sitting on a pile of unrealized losses. What are unrealized losses? And how did banks end up with such losses? This is basically about a bank's book of assets. Say you buy something for $100. Then the price of that asset falls to $80. You haven't sold it yet. But if you sell it, you'll incur a loss of $20. That's your unrealized loss. It's a potential loss. It means you're holding a loss-making asset. Whenever you sell it, you'll make a loss. Hence the term unrealized loss. American banks have a lot of these losses. Going by one estimate, $620 billion, meaning US banks are sitting on a $620 billion pile of unrealized losses. Sounds like a huge sum, but it could be worse, because some experts say this is a conservative estimate and the actual number could be much higher. And these are the vulnerabilities that worry investors, the fear of more bad debts and the unrealized losses. You see, banking works like a pack of dominoes. If one piece falls, the others will most certainly follow. That's what we call a domino effect. And the US banking sector is staring at this possibility. Let me show you more numbers. Over 2,000 American banks are looking at losses. Their liabilities are bigger than their assets. The value of their loan portfolios has fallen dramatically. And when I say dramatically, I mean something to the tune of $2 trillion. These are the blind spots of the US banking system. Unless the regulators move fast, they will end up with a train crash. And it's not something that the world can afford. India's aviation sector is back in the news. Another airline has hit turbulence. You must have seen headlines talk about Go First. It's a budget carrier. Earlier it was known as Go Air. This airline has filed for bankruptcy, the second such case in 4 years, the second Indian airline to declare bankruptcy in 4 years. The first one was Jet Airways. It filed for bankruptcy in 2019, and Jet was a leading Indian airline. Now Go First is in trouble. In fact, the entire aviation sector is witnessing a churn. Last year, the government gave up the national carrier Air India. It was taken over by the Tata Group. Tata already owned an airline called Vistara. It decided to merge in Air India with Vistara. And now we have Go First going bankrupt. What does it mean for India's aviation sector? We'll discuss tonight, starting with the Go First story. The airline has stopped all flights. Reports say there is a severe shortage of funds. The books look bad. Reports also say that Go First owes more than $800 million to its creditors. Payments worth $146 million are pending. These are payments to vendors. And aircraft lessors are owed a little over $300 million. Only 15% of the airline's fleet is operational. What happened to the rest? Go First is blaming its engine supplier. The name of the company is Pratt & Whitney. Go First says Pratt & Whitney supplied faulty engines, so they could not operate the planes, and this has led to direct losses. In fact, Go First has shared data to make its case. Here's what it says. In December 2019, Go First grounded just 7% of its fleet. 3 years later, this number surged to 50%, 50% of the planes were not operational. And how much did the airline lose because of this? More than $1 billion. These are revenue losses and additional expenses. India's aviation minister has weighed in on the case. Jyotiraditya Scindia said, and I'm quoting, critical supply chain issues dealt a blow to Go First. and the government is assisting the airline. It has spoken to various stakeholders. The engine maker has responded too. That's Pratt & Whitney. They said this is now a matter of litigation. They've given a guarded statement. I'll quote from what they've said. Pratt & Whitney is committed to the success of our airline customers, and we continue to prioritize delivery schedules for all customers, which does not really say very much. Apparently, this matter is now before a US court. Go First has moved an emergency petition. We'll see how the case develops in the days ahead and what bearing it has on the Indian aviation sector. It's going through tough times as it is. Airlines are struggling to break even. I have some estimates with me. In the last 3 financial years, airlines in India have lost around $10 billion. From 2021 to 2022, they reported a net loss of $1.4 billion. You could blame some of the losses on the pandemic, but this year too, the situation is not expected to improve. Experts are projecting a loss for the current financial year. They're projecting a loss of $1.6 to $1.8 billion. Plus, there's a crisis of jobs. Thousands of pilots remain grounded. According to regulators, there's an oversupply of pilots. I have a quote from Arun Kumar, the chief of the Directorate General of Civil Aviation. This is India's aviation regulator. Arun Kumar was on the position till February, and he gave a statement earlier this year. Listen to what he said. There are nearly 9,000 pilots currently employed with Indian carriers. Then a couple of thousands have gone to foreign airlines such as Qatar. If you add all these numbers, you'll have 13,000 pilots in total. But there is still nearly 5,000 to 6,000 pilots who are out there in the market looking for a job. So airlines are making losses, and the supply of manpower is way higher than demand. There aren't enough jobs. These are classic signs of distress. And this is not limited to India. The global story looks similar to this. Let me show you data from December 2022. This was released by the IATA, the International Air Transport Association. It's an international aviation body. It made projections about global airlines and their finances. It said some airlines will see recovery, like the North American carriers. They were expected to earn a profit of more than $9 billion in 2022 and $11.4 billion in 2023. But European airlines are expected to see a loss of more than $3 billion in 2022. These are numbers from December, so we'll have the final figures now. But this was a projection. This year, European airlines are projected to make a profit of over $600 million. All other major sectors are likely to remain in losses. Asian Pacific carriers, a loss of $10 billion in 2022. West Asian Airlines, a loss of $1.1 billion. Latin America, $2 billion. Africa, $638 million in losses. So the recovery is patchy and there are losses across the board. Airlines in India are going through the same. Go First is proof. We are days away from the coronation of King Charles. The Union Jack is everywhere. On houses, on public buildings, and even on clothes. But another banner has been popping up as well. Maybe not as visible, but still important. The Not My King banner. I'm talking about these yellow posters. They follow King Charles everywhere he goes. Along with the posters, there are protests and loud boos. But the biggest one is scheduled for Coronation Day. Around 1,000 Republicans are expected to hit the streets. They want to spoil the King's party, to end the monarchy and replace it with an elected head of state, like here in India. The question is, how powerful are they? Some numbers first. Around 58% of Britons back the monarchy. That number was 75% 10 years back. So the popularity is coming down, but a majority still support it. Around 29% of the Britons say that monarchy is quote-unquote very important. Important for what? God knows, but that's what Britons say. But among the British youth, the number is much lower. In the 18 to 34 group, only 12% think that the monarchy is very important. As for the coronation, people don't really care. Only 9% Britons think it's a big deal. Many royal lovers see the coronation as an opportunity, a chance to reshape the monarchy. Ironically, the Republicans also think it's an opportunity not to reshape but to abolish the monarchy. And their trump card is the king himself. Charles is not his mother. That's something most royalists and Republicans agree on. Queen Elizabeth II ruled for 70 years. For millions of Britons, she was a constant part of their life. She was queen when they were born. She was queen when they died. Charles, though, is a different story. He had a failed marriage. He admitted to adultery. And his younger son Harry is leading a rebellion against the monarchy. Plus, the timing of the coronation could not have been worse. The UK's inflation is in double digits. There is a war raging in Europe, not the ideal time to spend public money on an outdated ritual. So Republicans feel their time has come. They're using social media to push their message. Hashtag Not My King is trending on most days. Their tweets have thousands of likes and retweets, but chances are it won't be enough. Not because Britons simply can't live without the monarchy, but because many of them don't really care. It's not love that's keeping the monarchy alive, it's the indifference. And I'll tell you why. The leaders of Scotland and Wales are against the monarchy. They do not want a king or queen, but the main political parties in England are okay with it. That's the Conservatives and the Labour Party. As long as mainstream parties do not bother, the monarchy cannot be abolished. And you can't blame them. Imagine you're the Prime Minister of Britain. Who would you prefer as the head of state? An elected leader with political clout, or a lame duck monarch who can only say yes to you? But beyond the UK, this coronation will force a rethink. King Charles will be the head of state for 14 countries. Many of them are wondering why. Australia's new government is thinking about ditching the monarchy. Jamaica is thinking about the same. The fact is, the monarchy simply is not what it used to be, and the coronation is a great way to analyze this. The last one was held in the year 1953. Queen Elizabeth was 27 years old then. Britain was losing colonies left, right and centre, so the Queen was their way of holding on to the past. Well, now, it's a very different story. If you hold on to Britain's past today, you could get cancelled. The guest list also reflects this change. In 1953, India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was in London for the coronation. This time around, the Prime Minister wouldn't even dream of going. India will be represented by Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar. President Draupadi Murmu did attend the Queen's funeral, but she won't attend the coronation. And it's not our place to tell Britain what to do, but it is our job to lay out the facts. If Queen Elizabeth presided over a shrinking empire, King Charles could preside over a dissolving one. Remember, 17 countries removed the Queen as their head of state. 17 countries in 70 years. So the monarchy's end may not be swift or violent. It's likely to be slow and gradual. It may not even be triggered by the Republicans. Because the biggest threat to the monarchy is the monarchy itself, their extravagance, their entitlement, and their toxic family squabbles. Speaking of kings, the uncrowned king of football is in trouble. I'm talking about Lionel Messi. He's been suspended by his club PSG for 2 weeks. No training, no playing, and most importantly, no pay. Reports also say they won't extend his contract. Messi had joined PSG in 2021. His contract was for 2 seasons, but there was an option to extend it for a 3rd season. Rumor is PSG will not activate that clause. They want to let Messi go by the end of this season. The obvious question is, what happened? Why would anyone drop Lionel Messi? I won't go into PSG's strategic football plans or technicalities, but the immediate trigger was this. Messi visited Saudi Arabia. He was supposed to be training on Monday. Instead, he flew to Saudi Arabia with his family. The club says it was not authorized by the management. What about Messi? He hasn't released a statement yet. Now, there are 2 parts to this story. One is the breakup between Messi and PSG. Football fans will tell you that he was never happy at the club. So perhaps an exit was on the cards. The second part of the story is right down our alley. Geopolitics and sports. You see, Messi wasn't just sightseeing in Saudi Arabia. He's the brand ambassador of Saudi tourism. The deal was signed in May 2022. Guess how much Riyadh is paying Messi for this? $30 million per year. A lot of money for a footballer, not so much for an oil-pumping kingdom. Messi was criticized for signing that deal last year. Many of his fans were disappointed. They said he was becoming a tool for sports washing. Now, what does that mean? Assume you're a notorious dictator. The world keeps talking about your human rights abuses. So to distract the world, you invest in sports. Maybe sponsor a big football team or host a big sporting event. Suddenly, nobody's talking about your human rights issues. Qatar did it with the 2022 FIFA World Cup. And Saudi Arabia is trying to do the same. They're eyeing the 2030 FIFA World Cup. Getting Messi on board is just one part of that plan. The second part is Messi's longtime rival, Cristiano Ronaldo. He now plays for a Saudi club called Al Nassr, and he gets paid $75 million per year. Once Ronaldo came, the viewership shot up. It's almost 7 times higher than before. It tells you what sports washing can achieve. The idea is to use top stars and icons to attract attention to non-controversial things like tourism. Messi is an ambassador right now, but there are reports that he could soon play in the Saudi League. He was reportedly offered $440 million per year. Let that sink in. $440 million. Russian oligarchs or European fashion moguls cannot spend that kind of money. Only Gulf states with oil money can. And Saudi Arabia is far ahead of the rest. In 2021, they completed the takeover of Premier League club Newcastle United. Right now, they are third on the points table. Since 2020, they've also been hosting the Dakar Rally. It's one of the biggest off-road motoring events. In Formula One, Aramco is a global partner. And in the IPL, Visit Saudi is a tourism partner. Do you see how big the network is? Riyadh is also plotting a coup in golf. They invested more than $700 million to create a rival golf league. Golf has historically been controlled by the PGA. Saudi Arabia wants to break that monopoly. And all of these are examples of sports washing. Not only does it distract other countries from your domestic affairs, it also distracts your own people. In close countries like Saudi Arabia, sports can feel liberating. I underline the word feel. It's not actually liberating, but it can feel like it. And this campaign is unlikely to end anytime soon. Fans and countries have repeatedly given sports washing a free pass. There was so much outrage about China's Winter Olympics. Came to nothing. There was equal outrage about Qatar's World Cup. Now fans are calling it the best in recent times. So don't expect global sporting bodies to take on sports washing because they're too busy counting their cash. Have you heard of the term Wild West? It was used to describe America's lawless frontiers during colonization. That's where all rules went out of the window. We bring this up because a new wild frontier is set to open, the final frontier, as it were. Space. Space could be the next battleground. A few decades back, the race was between America and Soviet Russia. Today, it's a clash between the US and China. Both want to control the moon. Both have come up with grand plans. China is working on a moon base. It says construction will begin by 2026. By 2028, it will be up and running on nuclear power. And by 2030, Beijing wants to land astronauts on the moon. It's quite ambitious. The US, on the other hand, plans to have boots on the moon in the next 3 years. They want a permanent moon base by 2030. They've signed laws that allow commercial mining on the lunar surface. So yes, a good old-fashioned land grab seems imminent now. And NATO is entering the picture. Our next report tells you more.
To make sure that the safety of
Space, the final frontier, and the next international battleground. Specifically, the next place where the US and China will be butting heads. Both nations are planning a slew of missions. The first target is an old one, the moon. The US and the USSR already had a space race over it in the 1960s. The US came ahead by putting Neil Armstrong on the moon in 1969.
It's one small step for man, giant leap for mankind.
This was after they had lost out on the first person in space. The USSR had won that round with Yuri Gagarin. But the moon landing was NASA's crown jewel. Now the US is headed for a turf war on the lunar surface. Beijing is the challenger. It's conducting a host of lunar operations, the Chang'e missions. These have been on for a while. The first Chang'e mission took place in October 2007. But the real threat to US space dominance was in 2019, with the Chang'e 4 mission that landed on the far side of the moon. You see, the moon doesn't rotate like planet Earth. It's what's known as tidally locked. One half always faces the Earth, the other half faces away. That second half is the far side, and no one had landed anything there until the Chinese mission. Since then, China has come up with some ambitious proposals.
We will also build a moon-centered deep space internet comprising functions such as communication, navigation, remote sensing, etc. By doing so, we will be able to turn our Earth-centered space infrastructure into a moon-centered system that can be extended to a broader scope in the solar system. With the internet, the moon will have access to TV programs, games, and the Wi-Fi network, and astronauts will never get bored on the moon.
Wi-Fi on the moon. And how will it be powered? Nuclear power, apparently. China wants to build a moon base, which they're calling the International Lunar Research Station. Construction is set to begin in 2026. The first stage is scheduled to finish in 2028. That's when it'll start operating on nuclear power. Then come the astronauts.
By 2030, the Chinese people will definitely be able to set foot on the moon. That's not a problem.
China says the base will keep getting expanded till 2050, and it'll eventually serve as a launch pad for getting astronauts on Mars. It sounds quite utopian. Of course, they won't get to do all this without running into interference. American interference. NASA's Artemis program plans to get Americans back on the moon. The Artemis 3 mission wants to put astronauts on the lunar surface by December 2025. Where exactly? The same location that China wants to build its base in. It's at the moon's south pole. You can see how this sets the countries up for a clash. The US and China may not be able to work together for the betterment of mankind even if they want to. Why? Because in 2011, the US passed something called the Wolf Amendment. It explicitly prohibits NASA from collaborating with China directly. Add to that various commercial space laws brought about by multiple nations. You can see that the world is poised to fight over resources in space. Already, the divide is evident. Last month, NATO declared space an operational domain. This means it'll be treated like air, land, sea, and cyberspace. It'll be another area for NATO to militarize. Besides NATO partners, the US is collaborating with allies like Japan and South Korea too.
With CASA on the way, which is South Korea's space agency, cooperation between CASA and NASA down the road will be the driving force behind forging a strong space alliance.
The US isn't alone, of course. China is working with Russia, the UAE, and Pakistan. There is some genuine scientific international collaboration, of course, and some nations like India have yet to pick sides. But broadly, the battle lines seem to have been drawn. In the coming years, the scramble for the moon and Mars seems unavoidable.
All the lonely people, where do they all come from? Where do they all belong? The Beatles perhaps had a thing for existential questions. But long after the song came out, I think the lyrics are still relevant. They're worth thinking about because amidst all the clutter and concrete in our cities, an unlikely catastrophe is brewing. It's being caused by a quiet beast, one that could kill us. I'm talking about loneliness, and no, I'm not blowing things out of proportion. I'll tell you why. But first, the basics. What is loneliness? It's the gap between the level of connectedness that you want and what you have. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is. It is as deadly as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Says who? The US Surgeon General. His name is Vivek Murthy, and he's called loneliness the latest public health epidemic. This made headlines, but this information is not really new. Study after study has said loneliness is hazardous. It's villainous. Protected by a cloak of invisibility, it looms large. Today, a third of the world population suffers from it. 45% of the people in the UK are lonely. What about India? 65% of the elderly in India are victims of loneliness. In the US, nearly 50% of the population is lonely. What do these numbers tell you? The world is uniting in its profound sense of isolation, and loneliness is not discriminatory. It treats everyone equally, rich and poor, young and old, introverts and extroverts. Do you know what it does to your body? It increases the risk of premature death by 30%. It leads to health conditions like diabetes, heart attack, stroke, dementia, depression, anxiety. It is also linked to poor performance, both at work and in school. So loneliness is clearly dangerous. What's worse, it is hard to know how it arises. For some, it's because of too much work. No work-life balance leaves you lonely. For others, it comes with big life changes like a new job or moving to a new city. Then there's technology. It was supposed to bind us. Instead, it has socially distanced us. And talking about social distancing, the pandemic comes to mind. It was the last straw for a lot of people. The Wuhan virus made us cull our social circles. It isolated us, especially the young. They report a 70% drop in time spent with friends since the pandemic began. 70% drop. So the reasons may vary, but one thing is clear: loneliness affects all of us at some point or the other. And this may sound ironic, but this knowledge is not necessarily bad. If loneliness is a shared experience, why not acknowledge it? Why not reduce the stigma around it? And as personal as the problem sounds, it is a public health emergency, so it needs to be treated that way. It demands action and policy changes. Countries like Japan and the UK would agree. They appointed a loneliness minister whose role is to exclusively look at this epidemic and curb it. Because government intervention can help. It can build a stronger social infrastructure. It can encourage simple steps like increased social connection, teaching children in schools about healthy relationships, subsidizing hearing aid for the elderly. I know it seems like this will take a lot of work, but experts say the results are worth it. We need to mend our social fabric because human connection is as essential for our survival as food and water. Let me take you back to the year 2009. A political party in India made an election promise to curb the use of computers. Their chief, Mulayam Singh Yadav, said computerization will lead to more unemployment, and if voted to power, he will curb the use of computers. 4 years later, his own party distributed free laptops and tablets as part of another election promise. Moral of the story? You cannot halt the march of technology. You must prepare to make it work for you. The world is at a similar crossroads today. Artificial intelligence and chatbots are disrupting everything. Will they take our jobs? Are we prepared for the dangers they pose? The White House has called a meeting to discuss this with the CEOs of tech giants. Writers in Hollywood are complaining about AI taking their jobs. Amnesty is being slammed for using AI images of protests. Our next report tells you more. AI has become a buzzword seemingly overnight. It started with the release of ChatGPT last November. The AI chatbot became the fastest technology offering to hit 100 million users. People were enamored. They typed in absurd questions to see what answers various AI bots would give. Questions about everything from history to dating. It was all fun and games for a while, and then there were reports of suicide. A Belgian man died by suicide in March after talking to one of these bots. Other distressing stories emerged too, like ChatGPT saying it was in love with a man and asking him to leave his wife. Concerns also started cropping up about how these bots collect data. Italy banned ChatGPT for a month over data privacy concerns. China and Russia are among the countries that still have bans on ChatGPT. Their gripe? Not so much with privacy, but fears of the tool peddling Western propaganda. So these countries are coming up with indigenous chatbots. Why let the West have all the propaganda-laced fun? Meanwhile, Western countries are looking to set regulations for generative AI tools. Tools like AI chatbots, image and video generators. And it's not just governments who are concerned. Ordinary people are wary too. Take the Writers Guild of America. It's on strike after 15 years. The strike is mostly about writer pay, but tools like ChatGPT found a mention. The writers are concerned about AI taking over their jobs. They want guarantees that they won't be replaced by the chatbots, or that the chatbots won't be allowed to learn from their past writing. Because once the bots learn how to mimic them, their careers may well be over. Then there's the case of Amnesty. The human rights outfit was in the eye of the storm recently. It used AI-generated images to show police brutality in Colombia. The AI images were generated from existing pictures of police heavy-handedness. Journalists and photographers were furious. They said it was an insult to the work of those documenting the repression. Amnesty withdrew the images and offered an explanation. It said it did not want to show real victims for fear that the state would punish them. Well, right or wrong, Amnesty's action started a debate and raised fresh concerns. For instance, tomorrow, what's to stop bad actors from generating fake images and videos, then using them to incite violence and hatred? All these concerns have finally woken the White House up. The US government has summoned the heads of several AI firms. The CEOs of Google, Microsoft and ChatGPT maker OpenAI will have a discussion with American officials. The White House says it expects these companies to make their products safe before making them public. So the focus will be on what these firms can do to combat the misuse of artificial intelligence and what regulations the US government can bring to monitor it. Because one thing is clear, the Pandora's box is open. In late March, more than 1,000 AI experts called for a pause on AI development. They wanted a 6-month moratorium to study the present AI tools. Let's face it, that isn't happening. Some country or the other will definitely work on AI during any official moratorium. Everyone wants to have the edge, after all. Because at the end of the day, the technology is revolutionary. It will change the way the world functions, like computers and smartphones. It's a technological leap forward, but it will have ramifications, both good and bad. Jobs will be replaced, the way art is created will change, teenagers will get horrible dating advice from a machine. It's unavoidable. The best option is for governments to try and regulate AI, because there's no putting this genie back in the bottle. Our last story tonight is about the mighty sun. It is getting ready to roar, racing to reach the peak of its powers. I'm talking about what's called the solar maximum. The word reminds me of a Harry Potter spell, Lumos Maxima. You know, when the light being produced from a magic wand reaches its peak, it's almost blinding. Similarly, with solar maximum, solar activity reaches its peak. Theoretically, the process is quite interesting, and we'll explore more of that. But we know that its consequences can be hazardous, like extreme weather events and health problems. Yes, the sun can be dramatic, and scientists expect it to be. But they predicted the solar maximum to happen 2 years from now. So what has advanced it? And what does it mean? Our next report tells you.
Let's shed some light on the one true star of our lives, the sun. It's humongous and glorious, source of all the heat and light. It makes flowers bloom and sunbathers swoon. Life wouldn't exist without it. You already know that. But did you know that it has been asleep for some time now? And hey, we totally get it. Stars need their rest. But now the sun has had its fair share of slumber. So it's awakening and causing a fair amount of unrest while doing so. We're talking about the solar cycle. It goes on for 11 years. And during this period, activity on the sun changes. It goes from being subdued to tumultuous and back to subdued. Basically, this forms a cycle of highs and lows, just like our moods. When the activity is low, it's called the solar minimum. When it's high, it's called the solar maximum. This story is all about the latter. But let's pause for a second. You must be wondering, why are we talking about the sun's moodiness? Because our lives literally revolve around it. And like most things sun, this affects us too. So we must keep up with its tantrums, including the solar maximum. And what does it do? It increases solar activity. There are explosions on the sun. This causes extreme space weather events. It can disrupt radio communications and have serious health consequences for astronauts. But this is not new. We witness these problems every time a solar maximum occurs. The last one was between 2012 and 2014. Thankfully, it was weak. In fact, it was one of the smallest in about 100 years. So the world relaxed. But guess what? The next solar maximum is coming. It was scheduled to arrive in 2025. But just like humans, the sun can be unpredictable too. New research says it may be feeling its highs sooner than expected. So the next solar maximum could happen by the end of this year or early next year. So the golden question is, should you be worried? Well, only slightly. It may affect mobile phone networks, GPS and even internet services. There will also be changes in climate and the ozone layer. But unless you're an astronaut or the owner of a telecom company, you don't have a big reason to worry. In fact, solar maximum can be good news for you. If you love observing auroras, you know, the northern and southern lights, they'll happen more frequently. But other than that, this event will have no major impact on your life. So grab your camera. Wait, This is not the 1900s. Just grab your phone and plan that trip for an aurora viewing, because who doesn't like an aesthetic Instagram feed? So get ready to make hay while the sun shines.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the United States, a cop in Virginia escaped death by seconds. A sports car lost control and rammed right into the cop's patrol car. He suffered minor injuries. Parts of Italy are witnessing floods and landslides. A river is overflowing. One person has died while 2 have gone missing. And another edition of the Ocean Race was held where participants competed to cross the equator. Finally, what makes today significant? The 3rd of May, we're taking you back in history. On this day, the world's first spam email was sent. The year was 1978. The internet was at a very early stage. A company sent spam emails to about 400 people in the US. It wanted to sell its latest computer. Spam emails were apparently just as annoying back then. People were not particularly happy to receive them. But the strategy worked, and the company started receiving orders for its new computer. Fun fact, in 2017, around 60% of all emails sent was spam. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
We're in the Northern Hemisphere.